Good evening and welcome. I'm Azazel, and in tonight's episode, we wrap up our tour of Machida's paranormal hotspots. We start with an examination of Machida's own haunted tunnel, the Ayabehara Tunnel, and then we'll continue with a dive into the haunted Green Ridge Road, also called Tank Road, which will lead us finally to a nearby military base where U.S. service members and their families have for decades told tales of frightening and inexplicable encounters with ghostly soldiers from the past. Today on Ghostly Japan. Haunted tunnels are a staple of ghost stories the world over, and Japan is no exception. There are many famous haunted tunnels with truly disturbing histories, such as the Komine Tunnel, the Inunaki Tunnel, and Kiyotaki Tunnel, to name just a few. But there are also many other lesser-known haunted tunnels. Sometimes it seems that nearly every town in Japan has a haunted tunnel of its own. In this regard, Machida is no different. Machida's own haunted tunnel is the Ayabehara Tunnel. Situated on the Kamakura Highway, also known as Route Number 18, the tunnel connects Tama City to the north with Machida. Opened on March 26, 2005, it's a relatively new tunnel, but it wasn't long before stories began to emerge that something was off about the tunnel. The earliest claimed paranormal activity started the same summer the tunnel opened. Stories began circulating online that there was a stain or discoloration in the shape of a person on the road in the tunnel itself. According to the story, no matter how much the road crews tried to clean the stain from the roadway, this stubborn, humanoid stain persisted. Some of the tales speculated that the stain was linked to the spirit of a driver who crashed and died in the tunnel shortly after it opened. There are also a number of reported accidents, both inside the tunnel and just outside of the tunnel on the approach to the first intersection. Some infer that the high number of accidents are due to some undue paranormal influence. The one thing all versions of the story agree on is that the stain persists to this day. I was unable to corroborate the claims of a visible humanoid stain on the roadway, nor was I able to find any pictures. Perhaps, anticipating this criticism, one of the versions of the story claimed that the stain is actually not visible from the tunnel itself, but can only be seen when looking into the mouth of the tunnel while standing on one of the local surface streets that run parallel to the tunnel, although they neglect to provide any further guidance than that. As for the allegations of accidents in and around the tunnel, that there is some evidence for. It seems there have been a few accidents within the tunnel, but most of the incidents occur towards the entrance and exit, and leading up to the first intersection. One online testimonial I found, devoid of any mention of the paranormal, detailed a serious accident the writer was involved in at this tunnel. The author suffered only minor injuries, but witnessed another car that was completely destroyed. The fate of the driver of the other vehicle was dubious. The writer blamed the accident on the other driver's excessive speed and poor sight distance due to the curving nature of the tunnel, obscuring that traffic was stopped at the intersection ahead. While Ayabehara may not be as popular or impressive as some of the more famous haunted tunnels in Japan, it is still a locally well-known spot for those in Machida hoping to catch a glimpse of something paranormal. And regardless of whether the accidents have a more mundane explanation or are indeed paranormal, it might be wise to drive carefully should you ever find yourself driving down the Kamakura Highway. Stretching from the Machida Bioenergy Center in the east to Route Number 16 in the neighborhood of Yarimizu in Hachioji is Oneryokudo. This scenic route runs along the ridge of the Tama Hills and passes through the Sagami Plateau. This route runs along a road on either side before turning into a foot-only path in the center as the route passes through Oyamadairi Park. It is a popular spot in the spring for cherry blossom viewing, as there are 18 different varieties of cherry trees featured on the route. Walking down the well-maintained pathway, shaded by the sakura trees, it may be hard to imagine that this route is one of Machida's most haunted spots. But that is exactly the case, as numerous individuals have claimed to have experienced horrifying paranormal encounters. The stories run the gamut of paranormal experiences. Some claim to have encountered full-on apparitions of World War II-era Japanese soldiers walking down the pathway. Others claim that ghostly hands reach out of the ground trying to grab people's ankles, while some accounts claim to have heard a lone male voice call out from behind, but when they turn around find no one there. In some testimonies, people will suddenly fall ill while walking down the pathway. These hauntings are tied to Oneryokudo's past history, a time when it was known by a different name, a name that some of the older residents still call it by, Senchadoro, Tank Road. In 1943, the land was acquired by the Japanese government for use by the Imperial Japanese Army as both a test site and training ground for Japanese tanks that were being developed and manufactured at the nearby Sagami Army Arsenal. The original plan called for an extensive proving ground of 30 kilometers, but only about 8 kilometers were completed before the end of the war. According to the numerous ghost stories concerning Oneryokudo, the reason for the ghostly Japanese soldiers that stalk the path is that many are said to have taken their lives during exercises on Tank Road due to physical and psychological abuse they endured from their superiors. When talking about the Japanese military from World War II, a lot of attention is given to the kamikaze pilots and the fanatical resistance the troops put up, many choosing to die in their fighting positions rather than surrender. The Japanese military encouraged and glorified this type of suicidal behavior amongst its forces. What is less known is that the Japanese army had a serious problem with suicide, though, among its ranks. These were, for lack of a better term, ordinary suicides, initiated by the individual on their own, often outside of the immediate combat environment or even on the home front. In 1937, Japan dramatically escalated the situation in China with the Marco Polo incident, which began the Second Sino-Japanese War. By 1938, military authorities began to become concerned by what they described as a deplorable rise in unauthorized suicide among Japanese troops both deployed and those in a training environment within the home islands. A report was issued in 1938 by the Kempeitai, the military police, in which they stated that the Imperial Japanese Army now had the highest suicide rate in the entire world. The authors of this paper strongly urged senior military leadership to take steps to address the problem. This was an issue that was so culturally sensitive that the authors of the report chose to remain anonymous. The issue was sensitive because it stood in stark contrast to the efforts of Japanese policymakers who had spent much of the past decade trying to cultivate a national identity based on a belief of ethnic supremacy within Japanese society. It should be pointed out that the Imperial Japanese Army, when it was first created in the late 1860s by the Meiji government, modeled itself to emulate Western armies of the time. Even though most of the first generation of officers were former samurai, one of the earliest purposes of the Imperial Army was to protect the new government from threats posed by disgruntled former samurai. Emblematic of this, given Japan's long history of sword making, it may surprise some to learn that the new Imperial Army issued to their troops not the traditional Japanese katana, but in fact swords modeled on European and American swords of the era. While Bushido was still present in Japanese military culture at this point, as evidenced by General Nogi committing seppuku in 1912 after the passing of Emperor Meiji, in line with the old Bushido concept of junji, where vassals take their life after the master dies, reactions to General Nogi's actions at the time were mixed. There were some who glorified the general's actions as the ideal of a Japanese warrior, while others felt it was an outdated concept with no place in a modern society. These reactions mirrored Bushido's place in the new military, and indeed the argument of what exactly Bushido meant in modern parlance. It wouldn't be until the late 1920s and the early 1930s that, with rising militarism taking hold in Japan, that a concerted effort was made to connect the image of the samurai and an ultra-nationalist interpretation of Bushido to the military. In 1934, the Shingunto, the new military sword, was commissioned to replace the Western-styled swords that had been used up to this point. This new sword was styled to emulate the traditional Japanese swords of the Kamakura period, a visual representation of the change in culture that was taking place. New recruits were indoctrinated with the message that they were the heirs of the ways of the samurai, and were to conduct themselves according to the code of Bushido. There was to be no surrender. Death was not to be feared, nor needlessly embraced. Their lives were to be for the country and the emperor. At the heart of this was Yamato Damashi, the Japanese soul. Endowed with a singular uniqueness, the soul of the Japanese warrior was to allow him to overcome whatever obstacles he encountered. Hence why the 1938 Kempeitai report was so problematic for the Japanese army. How could the soldiers of the Imperial Army, with their superior Japanese spirit, also have a mental health crisis? Instead of tackling the problem from a medical point of view, the army leadership viewed it as a problem with discipline. The unauthorized suicides were viewed as squandering of imperial resources. The army started to differentiate between types of suicide. Unauthorized suicides were called jisatsu, whereas suicide in the commission of harming the enemy, such as kamikaze pilots and also when ordered by a superior officer to avoid capture, was termed jiketsu. Jisatsu was illegal and shunned, while those who engaged in jiketsu were venerated and honored. In the latter stages of the war, this would be extended to the civilian population, and Shudan Jiketsu, group suicide, would be ordered in places such as Okinawa, Saipan, and Manchuria. The army did commission a number of studies to investigate the cause of jisatsu after the 1938 Kempeitai report. The authors of those reports conspicuously failed to even entertain the notion of PTSD or shell shock as a possible cause. Some of the reports focused on categorizing the types of suicide, good versus bad. Others laid the blame on the individual as an aberration, or in one report claimed that they were suffering from untreated syphilis and had taken their own lives to escape the pain. One exception were the reports filed by Torao Hayao, a professor at the Kanazawa Medical College. He was conscripted in 1937 and sent to China. Professor Torao blamed the culture of hazing and physical abuse within the military, along with the repeated failure of military command to properly supply troops for operations and instead expect Japanese forces to overcome logistical issues with their superior spirit. He urged the military to rescind a policy that enabled Japanese troops to requisition supplies from civilians. He wrote that the failure to properly supply food to soldiers encouraged looting and led to criminal behavior and the breakdown of discipline in Japanese units. He believed that subsequently some soldiers, reflecting on what they had done, would come to the realization that they could not live with it and would take their own life. As evidence, he points to the fact that most of the suicides occurred in rear area areas away from the front, where soldiers would have the opportunity to be alone with their thoughts. He claimed that in many cases, the soldiers were heard to cry out an apology right before the act. Professor Torao would submit 6 reports before he would be recalled to Japan in 1939. His reports were classified and appear to have been largely ignored. He would serve as a doctor at a hospital in Japan for the remainder of the war. The Japanese military was only interested in the matter insofar as how to discourage jisatsu while still encouraging and permitting jiketsu. Unable or unwilling culturally to address the issue further, the only action that appears to have been taken was the disturbing 1940 order to expand the comfort station system to ensure good morale and discipline amongst the soldiers. These are the infamous government-run brothels that provided Japanese troops with comfort women. There does not appear to have been any further serious investigation into the matter past 1940. All of this to say that while I couldn't find anything officially stating that Japanese soldiers took their own lives on Oneryokudo, as the stories claim, given the historical background, it is absolutely possible that it occurred. It is also compelling that so many independent accounts claim that they've had some kind of paranormal encounter at this location. Of all the places we've discussed so far in these Paranormal Machida episodes, this one easily has the most alleged encounters. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the tales of ghostly going-ons extends to the aforementioned Sagami Army Arsenal as well. Located roughly 1 kilometer to the south of Oneryokudo, the Sagami Army Arsenal is known today as Sagami General Depot. While not actually in Machida, it is located in Kanagawa Prefecture, which borders Machida. Established in 1938 by the Imperial Japanese Army as the Sagami Weapons Factory, this location was primarily a production site for armored vehicles, artillery, and munitions. In 1940, the facility's name was changed to Sagami Army Arsenal. In the following clip from the March 2012 episode of Rising Sun, a U.S. Army Japan production, historian Hiroaki Hamada discusses the early history of the depot.
ここでの兵器製造の主なものとしては戦車ですね。中型のものですが、中型の戦車の製造を一番基本とした施設になってまして、記録では大戦中に約1500両ここで生産されたというふうにされております。で最も多いのがやっぱり砲弾の類ですね。砲弾手榴弾、これが多分トータルすると100万発ぐらいこの場所で作られていたというふうに推定されるんですが、戦車はですねさすがに金属が必要なので、戦況の悪化とともに金属の入手が不可能になったので、目標値にはなかなか達しなかったという記録になってますが、砲弾製造は順調に進んでいたようですね。この工場で作られてた主なその軍事装備なんですが、主力はですね97式といわれる中戦車だったようです。で果たして全て完成できたのかどうか分かりませんけれども、書類上では1561両ここで生産されたことになっております。その他に軽戦車ですね、軽戦車が802両という形です。それから、船もですね実はここで作られていたようでして、連絡艇という小さな小舟ですが、これが2557隻ここで作られたという記録があります。実はですね軍人の数ってそんなに多くありません。でここはもともとはですね、工場として作られた場所ですので、ほとんど働いた人々は民間人ということになります。で最盛期1万人以上の人が働いておりましたが、東北地方ですが九州地方の、いわゆる今でいう出稼ぎ労働者になるんでしょうか、そういった方々がこちらに来て職を得るという形で働いていたようです。で主力は先ほど申しましたように戦車と砲弾の製造だったんですが、その製造には当然技術者が必要になります。で技術者を養成するための養成学校ですね、そのようなものをこの施設内に設けられています。
Sagami Army Arsenal was also the site of the only operational test of the Japanese prototype super heavy tank, Oi. In response to the experiences of Japanese forces during the Nomonhan incident in 1939, namely the difficulty Japanese forces had with contending with Soviet armor, Colonel Hideo Iwakura drafted a requirement for a new heavy tank. Described as needing to essentially be a movable pillbox, Mitsubishi came up with the Mito tank. The design proposed a 100-ton multi-turreted tank armed with a 105mm cannon for its primary weapon. Two secondary turrets would house a 47mm gun and a 7.7mm machine gun. By February of 1942, the whole of this behemoth was completed. By May, the turrets were completed. However, the roof plate and other armor plates were delayed due to resource scarcity, and the project was delayed. By the summer of 1943, the tank was shown to senior members of the Imperial Japanese Army, including the commander of the Sagami Army Arsenal. The tank was renamed Oi to bring it into compliance with the new naming scheme for Japanese tanks. Field trials were scheduled for August 1st, and under a veil of secrecy in June, the tank was disassembled and shipped to Sagami Army Arsenal for testing. After reassembly, testing commenced on August 1st. The records indicate the testing was conducted at a test site to the north, which would correspond to Oneryokudo, but it was not explicitly stated. The first hour of tests apparently went without incident. However, during the second hour, the tank encountered problems during an off-road test. The tank reportedly sank a meter into the ground. Attempts by the tank to free itself resulted in serious damage to the suspension. The tank had to be towed back to Sagami Arsenal. Further tests were attempted on the concrete pad at the arsenal, but it only exacerbated the damage to the suspension. The tests were then halted and are not believed to have ever resumed. Ultimately, the tank was scrapped. Little documentation survived the war, and the only physical remnant of the tank is a single link of the tank track that is on display at the training school at JGSDF Camp Takigahara. In the following clip from the same Rising Sun episode, historian Hiroaki Hamada tells us about the former hospital on Sagami Depot.
こちら今病院に来ておりまして、正式名称は相模陸軍造兵所医務課という名称になっております。造兵所ができたのが1938年ですが、その3年後ですね、1941年にこの病院ができております。 で、当時の診療科目等を調べてみると、一般外来の受付もやっていたようです。で、その他ですね、放射線科、それからもちろん手術の外科ですね、が中心に置かれていた病院のようで、病棟が2棟と、それから隔離病棟というのがあったようです。で、1943年に実はこの造兵廠内で赤痢が集団発生したらしいんですが、その時にかなりこの隔離病棟に隔離された患者さんが多かったようですね。
After the end of the war, the US took over the base. Sagami Depot played a crucial role in repairing and refurbishing damaged American armor and vehicles during both the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The hospital was used to treat injured American service members. The hospital was used through the Vietnam War. At some point afterwards, the hospital on Sagami Depot was closed. It is this hospital that for decades has been the source of paranormal tales. The tales started while the hospital was still in operation. The earliest stories tell of a Marine patient who, in a state of psychological distress aggravated by alcohol, smashed the mirror in his room and used the broken pieces of glass to take his own life by slashing his wrists. Patients who were placed into the same room afterwards reported seeing eyes glaring at them in the dark, and seeing the ghostly, distressed face of the dead Marine in the mirror. The closing of the hospital did not end the ghost stories. The now derelict building was supposed to be locked up tight, but military police were repeatedly getting called to the building to investigate reports of possible break-ins. People driving by the building were reporting seeing movement and lights inside the empty hospital. On multiple occasions, police arrived to find the front doors wide open and the lock that had been used to secure the door mysteriously unlocked and on the floor. Windows that had been previously shut and secure were found to be wide open. Some MPs reported hearing strange noises following them inside the hospital while investigating. In 2013, the building was torn down. The activity seems to have ceased, at least for now. Thank you for watching. In the next Ghostly Japan video, we'll head out of Tokyo to one of the most famous, haunted, and infamous locations in Japan, Aokigahara, the Sea of Trees, also known as the Suicide Forest. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, please consider hitting the like and subscribe. Have a wonderful evening, and see you in the next installment of Ghostly Japan.